I'm delighted to be here. I said I would maybe make a few introductory remarks for 10 minutes or so, and I hope we can then have a discussion about issues that you are interested in that affect the transatlantic community or the global community or Europe in particular. I'm going to talk about two things very briefly, but before I do, I cannot resist the temptation to tell you the story that I always try to tell when I talk to people who might one day be diplomats or professionally involved in analyzing international crisis situations. The thing that's so difficult, but it's often underestimated, is to understand exactly what it is that you're seeing. Can you trust your senses? Is the crisis that you see actually what you're supposed to see or not? And there's this story that I like to illustrate the point, which is the story about a visit to Germany by not this current Pope, but his German predecessor, Pope Benedict, who came to his old hometown of Munich. I cannot promise to you that this is really a true story, but it is. I can promise you it's a good story. He came to his old hometown of Munich on an official visit, and after the conclusion of that visit, they put him into a gleaming, brand new 7 Series BMW to be driven over the Autobahn to Stuttgart. And as the driver was going up the ramp on the Autobahn, the Pope leaned forward and said, "Young man, maybe you know that when I was still the Archbishop here in Munich, I was driving my own Volkswagen. In Rome, they don't let me drive a car anymore, and I will never in my life have a chance to operate a 7 Series BMW. So would you mind?" So the young man says, "Your Holiness, as you like," and he pulls over, and modestly the young man gets into the back seat, and the Pope gets behind the wheel, and off they go. It is commonly known that on the Autobahn between Munich and Stuttgart, there are a number of speed traps, radar traps, installed by the Bavarian state police. So it doesn't take long until the Pope is stopped by this police car. The police officer, a young man, walks up to the car as is, not only tradition, but as they are taught. And he looks into the car, then he looks again, and then he decides to call his chief. And he says, "Chief, I've just stopped this car for speeding, but I'm not sure I should give him a ticket because I think this may be a kind of a VIP situation." The police chief says, "Young man, are you out of your mind? I don't care about a VIP situation. In Germany, before the law, everybody is equal. So if he was going too fast, give him a ticket." And he hangs up. So the young man looks into this automobile once more. And then he decides to call the chief once more and says, "Chief, before I make a big mistake, let me tell you that I really think this is, a special VIP situation." So the chief says, "But who is the person in the car?" And the young police officer says, "Chief, that's the problem. I haven't figured that one out. What I do know is his driver is the Pope." So, I see you're getting it. Story about identifying what you see correctly. Now to my subject. First, just a word about the current situation, Russia, Ukraine, and second, a word about Europe, about the EU. On Russia and Ukraine, I'm not going to give you a lengthy speech here. I want to just offer one or two brief observations. First, there are really two kinds of leaders in the world. I mean, you can categorize them in many different ways, but essentially, there's one kind of leader that tries to recreate the past. And there's the other kind of leader who tries to, move beyond the past and start from the present and create a new future. A good example of the second category is, for example, there are many examples, I'm sure, around the world, but one good example that I can think of is the famous, long-time leader of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who made of a swampy little port town a huge, major international hub, extremely prosperous, and you couldn't think how Asia would work without Singapore today. President Putin, seems to me, has decided to belong, at least as of now and for the foreseeable future, into the first category. He appears to try to recreate what used to be a Soviet or Russian empire. And my thought about this is the following, and I've said this to some of my own Russian friends. Look, if we Germans, or if we West Europeans, the Germans, the French, and others, if we had given in to that temptation, we would still be fighting with France over Alsace-Lorraine. We would still be fighting with the Poles over Silesia, borders that were moved back and forth in the 20th century and before a number of times. And we would certainly not be unified now because of all these troubles. Certainly no one would have had an interest in letting the Germans, get their country together in one again. In other words, we have learned that recreating the past is actually a very bad idea. Rarely good idea. That's my first observation about what President Putin is doing at the moment. Second, I think that, and of course I don't mean this seriously, but I mean it half seriously. In a way, we can always almost say in Western Europe or in the transatlantic alliance, we can say thank you, President Putin, for reminding us of some fundamentals of our policies, reminding us, our publics, that there is NATO, and actually that there's a good reason why we have NATO. It is also useful to say thank you for President Putin for reminding us that it is important for the European Union, and I'll come back to that in just a second, to speak with one voice, to be united, to have a foreign policy, if that's possible. And my third point, and then I'll stop on that one, is when you consider the environment in which this current crisis has developed, you can come to the conclusion, as the policeman came to the conclusion that he was looking at some VIP situation, you can come to the conclusion that President Putin is acting at this moment not out of a position of strength, but out of a position of almost desperate weakness. Apparently he feels that if he doesn't stop Ukraine from becoming a stable country with a close relationship with the West, he's going to lose something. In other words, he's not trying to create something, he's trying to stop something. That's negative, and it's actually not a good idea, certainly not for the in my view, for the long-term strategic interests of Russia. Trust, and this is something I've learned over the last 40 years, trust is the most precious commodity in international relations. Trust, if you misbehave, you can lose overnight. Takes one strange, wrong turn, one decision, and you will not be trusted anymore. Rebuilding trust, on the contrary, takes a long time. And it usually doesn't, it's not usually good enough to make some nice speeches. It takes practical, joint experience to create trust after it has been lost. So in my view, President Putin is really not doing his country a strategic favor, and that is why we should not get too excited about this crisis. We should understand that it's us who are strong if we stay united and if we have the strategic patience to handle him correctly. Now, just a word or two about Europe. And I'm addressing myself not only to the Germans and other Europeans present, but also to those of you who come from Asia or from other parts of the world. Don't give up on Europe. Don't think that Europe is a basket case, that Europe can't get its act together. Europe has actually, moved, not quite, but almost completely out of this financial crisis. I remember when I was in Washington, D.C., 2 years ago or 3 for major conferences, people were saying the EU is probably going to blow up or implode within the next 4 weeks. There were all these doomsayers around who predicted that the euro would disappear, that the EU was going to be at its, was going to sort of wither away, etc. None of that has happened. Even Greece, your grandfather's country, is now doing much better and coming out of the crisis in a remarkable way. So don't give up on Europe. The one thing that I believe, speaking on security, is, and we have had many discussions, Admiral Stavridis and I, both in smaller circles but also in large fora. What we have so far not been capable of doing in the EU is to get our act together in terms of pooling our military resources better. The one point, and then I'll stop, the one point that's important to make is that, when you put all the military expenditures of the 28 member countries of the EU together, it adds up to not quite, but almost half of what the US spends on military. But the output, the fighting capability, the fighting power is, it's not scientifically possible to pinpoint this, but it's probably not 50% of what the US produces, but maybe 10% or 5%. It's much lower than it should be. Why is that? Because we have too much duplication, where most of our countries are small countries, and it's, in my view, not a great idea for 28 countries, each one having its own general staff academy and training schools and own helicopter program and this and that. In other words, the big job for the future is how can we create more synergy effects in how we train our military, how we equip our military, etc. And you don't even need to talk at this moment about the European army, which may be, a faraway kind of vision, not a stupid vision in my view, but maybe a distant vision. But we can do much better, I believe, than we have done in the recent past in terms of helping the US navigate these many crises that are confronting us in the Middle East, in Asia, now again in Europe, right at our doorstep. And that is why, final point, the transatlantic relationship, which was what brought me here initially to Fletcher, and which is at the heart of the annual Munich Security Conference, the transatlantic relationship remains extremely important for us in Europe, and I hope Americans, even though they're pivoting to Asia, et cetera, recognize that their best friends when push comes to shove, are still in Europe, even if we are sometimes hard to live with. Okay, thank you very much for your patience. That's the million-dollar question, Jim. I would make a distinction between, the short term, the crisis, Russian aggressive behavior on Crimea and now on Ukraine, more generally, short term, and the longer term, the strategic. In the shorter term, I think we've been doing the right thing. We needed to demonstrate to Russia that this is not only not okay to behave in this way, it's going to have a price, which is why we have started to impose these sanction measures on Russia. I think that's fine, but sanctions in and of themselves are not a strategy. I believe that the strategy ought to be not how can we maximize punishment for Russia. The strategy, question number one, has got to be how can we maximize stability and prosperity of Ukraine so that Ukraine becomes a place that is functional and not dysfunctional. I think that's the short term. In the longer term, and that is really the answer to your question, I believe that we need to continue to talk to Russia, or at least to offer to talk to Russia, depending on whether they're willing to engage and to listen. I believe it's important for us to talk to Russia again about what kind of order we believe should exist globally, what kind of international order we need, also Russia needs, by the way, based on norms and institutions, what kind of European security architecture we believe should exist. Obviously, Russia has decided at least to ignore part of the existing order, of the existing general belief that we thought we had agreed that no border was going to be changed unless by mutual agreement. And here in this case, all of a sudden, borders are being changed, not in the way that we thought, Europe was now being handled. So I think we need a longer-term strategic dialogue with Russia, trying to draw Russia into this. I believe it is in the absolute desperate interest of Russia to live in an environment where international norms and institutions exist. The risks of instability for Russia are 10 times greater than those for Europe. They have borders that are vastly more uncertain than our borders. I mean, we're actually in a safe place, relatively speaking, in Western Europe. But imagine all the Islamic countries at the Russian underbelly, and we were talking about it earlier, and the 1.5 billion Chinese, in the Far East, who are looking across the border at an empty, vast place called Siberia, also not a recipe for permanent stability. In other words, there are long-term challenges for Russia that are very substantial. Russia desperately needs to move beyond being a petrostate, needs to be a country that moves successfully into the kind of a post-industrial world. Russia has very smart people, a high level of education, so some elements exist, but they're not being used at this moment. So I think that's what we ought to try to do. The question is, are they willing to listen? I can only say that when I was at a big conference this past weekend in Washington, speaking to some Russians who were not necessarily the envoys of Mr. Putin, but more liberal critics of Putin, they are saying to us, go to Moscow. I mean, at the highest level, if possible. Those should go to Moscow who will have a chance to be listened to by President Putin and his senior advisors, there is, in my estimation, at this moment, not enough dialogue. So I am against those who are saying we should cut off all discussion, ignore Russia, and only slap sanctions on them. I think that's not a good, certainly not a good diplomatic recipe. Well, I speak under the control of the former SACEUR here. Let me give you a very personal view. I believe that as we are reminded of NATO's original purpose, which is the defense of, the NATO member countries, and I think it's very important that we are reminded, because there was a tendency, certainly including in my own country in recent months, before this crisis erupted, that there was a tendency to believe that once the Afghanistan expedition is over, what do we need NATO for? Even senior politicians would not shy away from asking that question. So I think it is useful to have this reminder of the original purpose of NATO. And my view is that the more we are reminded of reinvigorating NATO because of the original purpose, the easier it will be to also to deal with what you call the ancillary functions or additional purposes of NATO. I think it would have been very hard for Jim's successors, both military and civilian, to keep NATO dynamic and active if in coming years more and more people had thought that we entertained this NATO organization only to carry out these, support and help missions in faraway countries. I think political support for that would have probably slowed down and petered out more or less. So I think actually this shot in the arm that NATO is now getting publicly and by political leaders is actually good also for the purpose of additional NATO functions. Okay, thank you. That's a good question. Well, let me clarify one point. EU membership is not something that you sort of just apply for and get because you want it. EU membership requires for you as a country to meet a huge number of conditions. I know of no country in Europe that responds less today to the EU membership conditions than Ukraine. I mean, it's a totally dysfunctional country with a traditionally corrupt elite. It will take a long, long, long time for Ukraine to meet the standards for a serious discussion about EU membership. I add in parentheses, this is why I agree with some critics who have said the EU sent the wrong message when they offered this association agreement with Ukraine without explaining that this was about association and not about a first step quickly followed by a second step called membership. And maybe that was misunderstood also in Moscow to a certain extent. So I think we are very, very far away from a serious discussion of an EU relationship or membership. But yes, you are right. This is going to cost a lot of money. The United States has just made available $1 billion. The EU, in cooperation with the IMF, is now talking about 11 billion, which is also interesting. 30 years ago it would have been the US 5 billion and the EU maybe also 4 or 5 billion. In other words, we are beginning to acknowledge that this is our problem first and the US problem second or third. we accept the fact that we can't expect the United States to take care of this basket case called Ukraine. But it is, of course, our hope that international institutions like the IMF will chip in a substantial way. I think that two things need to happen. The European Union or the member countries of the EU need to accept the fact that if we want to avoid a long-term risk of instability at our eastern border, which is at the same time, you know, the border of Poland and Hungary, et cetera, we need to invest in making of Ukraine a stable country. That is not going to happen overnight. Unfortunately, this country has gone through very difficult decades since the breakup of the Soviet Union. I believe there are enormous opportunities in Ukraine because there is a strong industrial base, but as a country, it is not functioning at the moment. So it will take a huge effort. But I do agree that this will be our task, number one. I believe the European Union is accepting that, and I think we would be making a historic mistake if we thought that we could get away just with some nice speeches and short-term crisis support. It will require a very long-term effort, over a decade or so. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it was 1,000 pages or 700, but the EU tends to be extremely bureaucratic, and yes, they tend to present these lengthy documents. Association with the EU means, of course, harmonizing everything from customs rules to certain standards, etc. So this is technically complex and ambitious. It's much easier, you know, for NATO, for example, to have some clearly established criteria and to say, okay, you can be a member of the Partnership for Peace or something like this. That is a lot easier to accomplish in terms of bureaucratic complexity. The EU made a mistake, in my view. The EU approached the question of Ukrainian association as if the Ukraine was Iceland. In other words, an island in the North Atlantic with a lot of water around. Ignoring a little bit that there were these historic, political, economic, and other ties with Russia and with other neighbors. So I think if we can be accused of something, it's probably, we should be accused of too technical an approach. But it was not an illegal approach. We didn't violate international law. We may have behaved in a slightly foolish way, but there was nothing that the EU ever did with respect to Ukraine that deserves a response by military force or by stealth or covert operations. I mean, that should also be clear. You know, in other words, I don't want to be misunderstood. I think that we may not have had a perfect arrangement here, but the ones who violated established principles of international law were the Russians, and only the Russians. And that also needs to be said very, very clearly. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good question. I know I need to be brief here. One is an industrial problem. That's hard and that's complex. When you talk about the EU and military hardware, you talk about half a dozen countries who carry the ball: France, UK, Germany, Spain, Poland. The others also have a bit of military production, but not that much. Making countries agree that your shipyard should be closed because the shipyard in the other country is now going to build the frigates is a tough thing if you are an elected politician from that particular shipbuilding city. So, let me just stop here and say that's hard, but it needs to be done. We need to decide that we should not have 7 or 8 shipyards. How many shipyards does the U.S. Navy use? A small number. 3. We have at least 3 times that. In other words, we're spending our money not responsibly in the EU. The other part is training, and I think there it's easier, training and using your resources. We started a few years ago among a smaller group of countries a program that would allow the joint use of available military transport aircraft. A group of countries, got together, bought a computer, put a few people in front of the computer and put all their aircraft into the computer. And without going into the details now, it's quite clear that these airplanes are being better used now, more often used in terms of the economics of buying and servicing aircraft. This has been a very successful program. So I think that's what we ought to be doing, establishing pilot programs in various areas, whether it's helicopter school or joint use of military transport aircraft or joint training of soldiers, which I believe is extremely important, because if we expect our soldiers to work together in conflict, it's also helpful if they've been trained together from day one. And I believe that if you are a group of 28 countries, it's really not a great idea to have a significant number of small countries who entertain an air force of 12 or 16 aircraft. If you have read Economics 101, you've heard about the economies of scale problem, and in that sense, economies of scale can be used in our European context with great success if we have the political willpower to do it and to go into niche building and allow certain countries to have this capability and others to have another capability. Actually, because of budgetary constraints, etc., we are already moving into this, without really knowing it, without the public knowing it. Admiral Stavridis knows the details much better. Our neighbors in Holland, for example, as far as I understand, they have given up the last cannon, long-range, artillery already a few years ago. In other words, if they needed that in combat anywhere, they would need one of their NATO partners to come with the artillery capability to help out. But I think that's the way, the direction in which we should go. And we could go a long way towards doing things better, faster, more efficient. Thanks again for your patience. It's great to be here.